Gambling on sports has become a lot more common these days. At least when you look like you're out in the world and you see the number of ads for these sports betting sites, it seems to have really, really taken off. And they're trying to convince you to gamble, to spend some money. And that could have some consequences. In fact, there are some recent studies out there that look at the connection between sports betting and your money. And there's some interesting and applicable things that we should be talking about in the context of your personal finances. Our guest is Preet Banerjee. He is a wealth management consultant and personal finance expert. He first wrote about sports betting in the Globe and Mail. He joins us today from London, England. Hello there.
Hi, Bruce. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. What has changed? Why are these ads everywhere?
Well, they certainly are everywhere. I mean, you don't even have to be watching sports anymore. It seems like every program on TV, you're bombarded with nothing but back to back gambling ads. And sometimes it's the same ad run multiple times. That's how much money the gambling industry is throwing at the consumer. And this was because of a change in laws back in 2021 in Canada, which basically made gambling and gambling online more available, more widespread. And part of the reason that they did that, I think, was that the United States did it in 2018. And so you started to see all these arenas being named after these sports gambling enterprises. And it just became such a big thing. So Canada followed suit. And I think they maybe didn't realize what the financial consequences were for households. And because these changes were made in 2018 in the US, we kind of have a 3-year crystal ball of what these changes portend for Canadians.
And it's not so great. So, you and I see the world from a similar perspective, in that we look at all the things that Canadians are dealing with from the perspective of their money. What are some insights from the research coming out of the US, given that they've got a 3-year leg up?
Yeah, well, the first thing is that sports gambling and gambling online on sports has exploded. So, just in 2023, the rate of increase after 5 years of the change in the law in the US was still growing at 46%. So,
Hmm.
the rate of increase is absolutely huge. The other thing that we're seeing is that it comes at a big cost, and it comes at the cost of traditional retirement savings. So the studies found that for every dollar that was spent betting was correlated with $2.13 less in traditional investing. And what they found was in the states where, they could track how much households were betting after the changes in the laws, they were spending about $1,100 in bets. US. So if you convert that to Canadian dollars at the exchange rate at the time, it's about $1,500 per year per household. And had people simply put that into a prudent retirement portfolio with a modest 5% rate of return, that would work out to about $250,000 down the road. So people are maybe unknowingly making this exchange where they're going for the quick, get rich quick fix in exchange for a disciplined, prudent investment plan that could be worth hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Now, here's the yeah, but that loyal or committed sports bettors would probably want me to ask, and that is sometimes they win. So, how did they factor that in? Because if you win, that changes the math.
Well, I think this is a false sense of confidence that people have because everybody knows that the house always wins,
Yeah.
which means someone else has to lose in the aggregate. So while there might be some outliers, there's very few of them who make a lot of money and don't then blow it away later down the road. And so this is leading to addiction problems. And there's been a dramatic increase. There was a study that looked at the calls to problem gambling helplines, and there's different types of gambling. And when it comes to sports gambling, the percentage of calls had increased from about 36% to almost half of calls received for gambling was for sports gambling since the change in Ontario. So this is a massive impact to households. And we're also finding that it is hitting the most impoverished households the hardest. So people with the lowest median savings and people who have a history of going into overdraft are actually faring much worse than everyone else. Bankruptcies spiked about 25 to 30%, 3 to 4 years after the laws were changed in the United States. And there are these knock-on effects where the people who are trying to maybe, take a Hail Mary because their situation is worse than
Mhm.
average are getting hurt the most.
I think another question that is fair to ask is the source of the research. And I ask because if this is academic in nature, it's very different than if it's driven by someone with skin in the game. What can you tell us about those two studies in terms of the way that they would be seeing the world from the get go?
Yeah, absolutely. So these were academic studies, they were peer reviewed. Now, they looked at research or data in the United States. And there were two papers that came out with about a month of each other back in 2024.
Hmm.
And so, again, they were looking at changes that had been in place for about 5 or 6 years in the United States, which is why I'm saying, we can probably say with, a good sense of reasonability that this translates fairly well to the Canadian landscape. And I think the numbers that we do have for the Canadian data do support that, especially when you look at the increase in calls about sports gambling and these addiction hotlines.
Were there any recommendations or actions that that research prompted that we also might be able to learn from?
Yeah, I think politically and practically, they would be hard for people to swallow, but the recommendations are just what you would expect: more restrictions
Mm.
on gambling advertising, setting limits, and having higher set standards of regulation. Now, there have been some changes because people are not blind to the impact that this is having. We've seen a lot of celebrity endorsements. Now the laws have been changed, at least in Ontario, where if you are going to get some kind of celebrity to endorse gambling,
They need
and
to
they've
be a
got
crappy celebrity. They need to be a non they need to be a soap opera star. They can't be a pop star.
no, unfortunately, it can still be a very popular celebrity, but the way that they're allowed to be on those advertisements is if it's a sort of public service announcement to make people aware of the dangers of gambling. But to be honest, if you're younger and you see your favorite celebrity endorsing a gambling platform, I think it's still going to entice you to gamble.
Mm. You have an extraordinary background in behavioral finance, academic and practical, and in your consulting practice as well. What are some of the things that you would bring into this conversation in terms of the behavioral science to reduce the risk that an individual will bet away their retirement savings?
Yeah. So if you look at the friction, essentially what these law changes did was they reduced the friction to gambling by making it available not only more widespread, but also online. So before, there might have been a stigma associated with going to a casino to place bets, and it took a lot of time and effort to do that. But now you can do it from the comfort of your home. You can do it while you're in the washroom with your phone in your hand or on your commute to work. And so the friction has been reduced. And so if you want to reduce behaviors, you want to increase the friction. So you can either delete those apps or hopefully policymakers can make some changes that make it a little bit harder, at least, for people to access online gambling sites. And I know that there are a lot of people who can gamble responsibly. The problem is the proportion of people who are affected to a very bad level, to the point where it rips apart families, in certain cases can lead to suicide and self-harm.
Mm.
Those dangers as a society, I think, aren't getting enough attention. And I think policymakers, with the aid of this new research, peer reviewed research, should take a look at strengthening those
Mm.
regulations.
And nonprofit credit counselors have been focused on this issue for decades, even when it
I'll
was just
bet.
traditional gambling at the casino down the road. We've done tons of work to try and support individuals in this context. One of the other challenges in terms of a human being's cognitive ability is mental math. And you highlighted this in terms of people thinking they're doing really well when we know the house always wins. How could an individual do a better job on that mental math so they can park the entertainment value and say it's like $200 a month? I'm not going to the bars. I'm just blowing that on sports betting, versus this delusion that that's going to be what pays their mortgage.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think if someone actually sat down and added up how much they have spent betting and how much they walked away from those bets, it's generally going to be net negative because, as we know, the house tends to win over the long haul. And while we do have these outlier situations where some people win some of the time, that's what brings people back. It's that hope that they'll make it big again. So you're preying on people's hope. And if you don't quantify that by, writing it down and doing the math, you have no idea just how much you are losing, because we tend to remember the highs that we get when we do hit it big. Win a couple $100, maybe a few $1,000s. That's a pretty intoxicating feeling for a lot of people. But if you were to compare that to what would you do if you put that money away on a consistent, regular basis, which I know is totally boring sounding, but if you take a look at how much that can grow to over time, that excites me, because that you're looking at a few 100,000, potentially millions of dollars that you could have down the road in exchange for a shot in the near term of maybe making a few extra bucks on average. It just doesn't look like a good trade-off to me, because I've seen the numbers.
And there are cheaper, less consequential ways to get that dopamine hit. Other ways. Preet, thank you for your insight today. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure, Bruce.
Preet Banerjee is a wealth management consultant. He's also a personal finance expert, and he was here to talk about research from sports betting in the US that probably applies pretty accurately here in Canada too, and it's worrying.